Chapter 2, Part 8 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, Volume 2, Chapter 2, The Witch Mania, Part 8. At Bamberg, in Bavaria, the executions from the year 1610 to 1640 were at the rate of about 100 annually. One woman, suspected of witchcraft, was seized because, having immoderately praised the beauty of a child, it had shortly afterwards fallen ill and died. She confessed upon the rack that the devil had given her the power to work evil upon those she hated, by speaking words in their praise. If she said with unwonted fervor, "What a strong man! What a lovely woman! What a sweet child!" the devil understood her, and afflicted them with diseases immediately. It is quite unnecessary to state the end of this poor creature. Many women were executed for causing strange substances to lodge in the bodies of those who offended them. Bits of wood, nails, hair, eggshells, bits of glass, shreds of linen and woolen cloth, pebbles, and even hot cinders and knives were the articles generally chosen. These were believed to remain in the body till the witches confessed or were executed, when they were voided from the bowels, or by the mouth, nostrils, or ears. Modern physicians have often had cases of a similar description under their care, where girls have swallowed needles which have been voided on the arms, legs, and other parts of the body. But the science of that day could not account for these phenomena otherwise than by the power of the devil, and every needle swallowed by a servant maid cost an old woman her life. Nay, if no more than one suffered in consequence, the district might think itself fortunate. The commissioners seldom stopped short at one victim. The revelations of the rack in most cases implicated half a score. Of all the records of the witch trials preserved for the wonder of succeeding ages, that of Würzburg from 1627 to 1629 is the most frightful. Hauber, who has preserved this list in his Acta et Scripta Magica, says in a note at the end that it is far from complete, and that there were a great many other burnings too numerous to specify. This record, which relates to the city only, and not to the province of Würzburg, contains the names of 157 persons who were burned in 2 years in 29 burnings, averaging from 5 to 6 at a time. The list comprises 3 play actors, 4 innkeepers, 3 common councilmen of Würzburg, 14 vicars of the cathedral, the burgomaster's lady, an apothecary's wife and daughter, 2 choristers of the cathedral, Gerbel Babelin, the prettiest girl in the town, and the wife, the 2 little sons, and the daughter of the councillor Stolzenberg. Rich and poor, young and old, suffered alike. At the 7th of these recorded burnings, the victims are described as a wandering boy, 12 years of age, and 4 strange men and women found sleeping in the market-place. 32 of the whole number appear to have been vagrants of both sexes, who, failing to give a satisfactory account of themselves, were accused and found guilty of witchcraft. The number of children on the list is horrible to think upon. The 13th and 14th burnings comprised 4 persons, who are stated to have been a little maiden 9 years of age, a maiden still less, her sister, their mother, and their aunt, a pretty young woman of 24. At the 18th burning, the victims were 2 boys of 12 and a girl of 15. At the 19th, the young heir of the noble house of Rotenhan, aged 9, and 2 other boys, one aged 10 and the other 12. Among other entries appear the names of Baunach, the fattest, and Steinacker, the richest burgher in Würzburg. What tended to keep up the delusion in this unhappy city, and indeed all over Europe, was the number of hypochondriac and diseased persons who came voluntarily forward and made confession of witchcraft. Several of the victims in the foregoing list had only themselves to blame for their fate. Many, again, including the apothecary's wife and daughter already mentioned, pretended to sorcery and sold poisons, or attempted by means of charms and incantations to raise the devil. But throughout all this fearful period, the delusion of the criminals was as great as that of the judges. Depraved persons, who in ordinary times would have been thieves or murderers, added the desire of sorcery to their depravity, sometimes with the hope of acquiring power over their fellows, and sometimes with the hope of securing impunity in this world by the protection of Satan. One of the persons executed at the first burning, a prostitute, was heard repeating the exorcism, which was supposed to have the power of raising the arch-enemy in the form of a goat. This precious specimen of human folly has been preserved by Horst in his Zauberbibliothek. It ran as follows, and was to be repeated slowly, with many ceremonies and wavings of the hand. Lale, Bakira, Magot, Bafia, Dajam, Vagoth, Henesh, Ami, Nagaz, Adomater, Raphael, Emmanuel Christus, Tetragrammaton, Agrajod Loi, Konik, Konik. The last 2 words were uttered quickly, and with a sort of scream, and were supposed to be highly agreeable to Satan, who loved to be called a king. If he did not appear immediately, it was necessary to repeat a further exorcism. The one in greatest repute was as follows, and was to be read backwards, with the exception of the last 2 words. Anion, Lale, Sabalos, Sado, Peter Aziel, Adonai Sado Vagoth, Agrajod, Bafra, Kom, Kom. When the witch wanted to get rid of the devil, who was sometimes in the habit of prolonging his visits to an unconscionable length, she had only to repeat the following, also backwards, when he generally disappeared, leaving behind him a suffocating smell. Zelianel heoti bonos vagota, plisos soter osek, unicus Beelzebub dax, com, com. This nonsensical jargon soon became known to all the idle and foolish boys of Germany. Many an unhappy urchin, who in a youthful frolic had repeated it, paid for his folly the penalty of his life. 3, whose ages varied from 10 to 15, were burned alive at Würzburg for no other offense. Of course, every other boy in the city became still more convinced of the power of the charm. One boy confessed that he would willingly have sold himself to the devil, if he could have raised him, for a good dinner and cakes every day of his life, and a pony to ride upon. This luxurious youngster, instead of being horsewhipped for his folly, was hanged and burned. The small district of Lindheim was, if possible, even more notorious than Würzburg for the number of its witch-burnings. In the year 1633, a famous witch, named Pomp Anna, who could cause her foes to fall sick by merely looking at them, was discovered and burned, along with 3 of her companions. Every year in this parish, consisting at most of 1,000 persons, the average number of executions was 5. Between the years 1660 and 1664, the number consumed was 30. If the executions all over Germany had been in this frightful proportion, hardly a family could have escaped losing one of its members. In 1627, a ballad entitled the Druten Zeitung, or the Witches' Gazette, was very popular in Germany. It detailed, according to the title page of a copy printed at Smalcald in 1627, quote, "an account of the remarkable events which took place in Franconia, Bamberg, and Würzburg, with those wretches who from avarice or ambition have sold themselves to the devil, and how they had their reward at last, set to music, and to be sung to the tune of Dorothea." End quote. The sufferings of the witches at the stake are explained in it with great minuteness, the poet waxing extremely witty when he describes the horrible contortions of pain upon their countenances, and the shrieks that rent the air when any one of more than common guilt was burned alive. A trick resorted to in order to force one witch to confess is told in this doggerel as an excellent joke. As she obstinately refused to own that she was in league with the powers of evil, the commissioners suggested that the hangman should dress himself in a bear's skin, with the horns, tail, and all the et ceteras, and in this form penetrate into her dungeon. The woman, in the darkness of her cell, could not detect the imposture, aided as it was by her own superstitious fears. She thought she was actually in the presence of the Prince of Hell, and when she was told to keep up her courage, and that she should be relieved from the power of her enemies, she fell on her knees before the supposed devil, and swore to dedicate herself hereafter, body and soul, to his service. Germany is perhaps the only country in Europe where the delusion was so great as to have made such detestable verses as these, the favourites of the people. Man schickt en Henkeisknecht, zu ihr in Gefängnis nimmt den Mann het kleidet recht mit einer Bärnhaute, als wenn's der Teufel wär, als ihm die Drut anschaute, meint's ihr Buhl kam daher. Sie sprach zu ihm behende, wie lässt du mich so lang in die Obrigkeit Hände? Hilf mir aus ihren Zwang, wie du mir hast verheißen. Ich bin ja eben dein, du mich aus der Angst entreißen. O liebster Buhle mein. Footnote. They sent a hangman's assistant down to her in her prison. They clothed him properly in a bear's skin, as if he were the devil. Him, when the witch saw, she thought he was her familiar. She said to him quickly, "Why hast thou left me so long in the magistrate's hands? Help me out of their power, as thou hast promised, and I will be thine alone. Help me from this anguish, O thou dearest devil, or lover mine." End footnote. This rare poet adds that in making such an appeal to the hangman, the witch never imagined the roast that was to be made of her, and puts in, by way of parentheses, "Was not that fine fun? Was das war für ein Spiel?" As feathers thrown into the air show how the wind blows, so this trumpery ballad serves to show the current of popular feeling at the time of its composition. All readers of history are familiar with the celebrated trial of the Maréchal d'Ancre, who was executed in Paris in the year 1617. Although witchcraft was one of the accusations brought against her, the real crime for which she suffered was her ascendancy over the mind of Mary of Medicis, and the consequent influence she exercised indirectly over the unworthy king, Louis XIII. Her coachman gave evidence that she had sacrificed a cock at midnight in one of the churches, and others swore they had seen her go secretly into the house of a noted witch named Isabella. When asked by what means she had acquired so extraordinary an influence over the mind of the queen mother, she replied boldly that she exercised no other power over her than that which a strong mind can always exercise over the weak. She died with great firmness. In 2 years afterwards, scenes far more horrible than any that had yet taken place in France were enacted at Labourg, at the foot of the Pyrenees. The Parliament of Bordeaux, scandalized at the number of witches who were said to infest Labour and its neighbourhood, deputed one of its own members, the noted Pierre de l'Ancre, and its president, Espaignel, to inquire into the matter, with full powers to punish the offenders. They arrived at Labour in May 1619. De l'Ancre wrote a book setting forth all his great deeds in this battle against the powers of evil. It is full of obscenity and absurdity, but the facts may be relied on as far as they relate to the number of trials and executions, and the strange confessions which torture forced from the unhappy criminals. De l'Ancre states as a reason why so many witches were to be found at Labour, that the country was mountainous and sterile. He discovered many of them from their partiality to smoking tobacco. It may be inferred from this that he was of the opinion of King James, that tobacco was the "devil's weed." When the commission first sat, the number of persons brought to trial was about 40 a day. The acquittals did not average so many as 5%. All the witches confessed that they had been present at the great Domdaniel, or Sabbath. At these Saturnalia the devil sat upon a large gilded throne, sometimes in the form of a goat, sometimes as a gentleman, dressed all in black, with boots, spurs, and sword, and very often as a shapeless mass, resembling the trunk of a blasted tree, seen indistinctly amid the darkness. They generally proceeded to the Domdaniel riding on spits, pitchforks, or broomsticks, and on their arrival indulged with the fiends in every species of debauchery. Upon one occasion they had had the audacity to celebrate this festival in the very heart of the city of Bordeaux. The throne of the arch-fiend was placed in the middle of the Place de Gallienne, and the whole space was covered with the multitude of witches and wizards who flocked to it from far and near, some arriving even from distant Scotland. After 200 poor wretches had been hanged and burned, there seemed no diminution in the number of criminals to be tried. Many of the latter were asked upon the rack what Satan had said when he found that the commissioners were proceeding with such severity. The general reply was, that he did not seem to care much about it. Some of them asserted that they had boldly reproached him for suffering the execution of their friends, saying, "Out upon thee, false fiend! Thy promise was that they should not die. Look how thou hast kept thy word! They have been burned, and are a heap of ashes." Upon these occasions he was never offended. He would give orders that the sports of the Domdaniel should cease, and producing illusory fires that did not burn, he encouraged them to walk through, assuring them that the fires lighted by the executioner gave no more pain than those. They would then ask him where their friends were, since they had not suffered, to which the father of lies invariably replied that they were happy in a far country, and could see and hear all that was then passing, and that, if they called by name those they wished to converse with, they might hear their voices in reply. Satan then imitated the voices of the defunct witches so successfully that they were all deceived. Having answered all objections, the orgies recommenced, and lasted till the cock crew. De l'Ancre was also very zealous in the trial of unhappy monomaniacs for the crime of lycanthropy. Several who were arrested confessed, without being tortured, that they were werewolves, and that at night they rushed out among the flocks and herds, killing and devouring. One young man at Besançon, with the full consciousness of the awful fate that awaited him, voluntarily gave himself up to the commissioner Espaignel, and confessed that he was the servant of a strong fiend, who was known by the name of Lord of the Forests. By his power he was transformed into the likeness of a wolf. The Lord of the Forest assumed the same shape, but was much larger, fiercer, and stronger. They prowled about the pastures together at midnight, strangling the watch-dogs that defended the folds, and killing more sheep than they could devour. He felt, he said, a fierce pleasure in these excursions, and howled in excess of joy as he tore with his fangs the warm flesh of the sheep asunder. This youth was not alone in this horrid confession. Many others voluntarily owned that they were werewolves, and many more were forced by torture to make the same avowal. Such criminals were thought to be too atrocious to be hanged first and then burned. They were generally sentenced to be burned alive, and their ashes to be scattered to the winds. Grave and learned doctors of divinity openly sustained the possibility of these transformations, relying mainly upon the history of Nebuchadnezzar. They could not imagine why, if he had been an ox, modern men could not become wolves by divine permission and the power of the devil. They also contended that if men should confess, it was evidence enough, if there had been no other. Del Rio mentions that one gentleman accused of lycanthropy was put to the torture no less than 20 times, but still he would not confess. An intoxicating draught was then given him, and under its influence he confessed that he was a werewolf. Del Rio cites this to show the extreme equity of the commissioners. They never burned anybody till he confessed, and if one course of torture would not suffice, their patience was not exhausted, and they tried him again and again, even to the 20th time. Well may we exclaim, when such atrocities have been committed in the name of religion, Quel lion, quel tigre, égale en cruauté, un injuste fureur, calme la piété. The trial of the unhappy Urbain Grandier, the curate of Loudun, for bewitching a number of girls in the convent of the Ursulines in that town, was, like that of the Maréchal d'Ancre, an accusation resorted to by his enemies to ruin one against whom no other charge could be brought so readily. This noted affair, which kept France in commotion for months, and the true character of which was known even at that time, merits no more than a passing notice in this place. It did not spring from the epidemic dread of sorcery then so prevalent, but was carried on by wretched intriguers, who had sworn to have the life of their foe. Such a charge could not be refuted in 1634. The accused could not, as Bodinus expresses it, "make the malice of the prosecutors more clear than the sun," and his own denial, however intelligible, honest, and straightforward, was held as nothing in refutation of the testimony of the crazy women who imagined themselves bewitched. The more absurd and contradictory their assertions, the stronger the argument employed by his enemies that the devil was in them. He was burned alive under circumstances of great cruelty. Footnote: a very graphic account of the execution of this unfortunate gentleman is to be found in the excellent romance of M. Alfred de Vigny, entitled Cinq-Mars; but if the reader wishes for a full and accurate detail of all the circumstances of one of the most extraordinary trials upon record, he is referred to a work published anonymously at Amsterdam in 1693, entitled Histoire des Diables et des Loudons, ou de la possession des religieuses Ursulines, et de la condemnation et du supplice d'Urbain Grandier. A singular instance of the epidemic fear of witchcraft occurred at Lille in 1639. A pious but not very sane lady, named Antoinette Bourguignon, founded a school or hospice in that city. One day, on entering the schoolroom, she imagined that she saw a great number of little black angels flying about the heads of the children. In great alarm she told her pupils of what she had seen, warning them to beware of the devil whose imps were hovering about them. The foolish woman continued daily to repeat the same story, and Satan and his power became the only subject of conversation, not only between the girls themselves, but between them and their instructors. One of them, at this time, ran away from the school. On being brought back and interrogated, She said she had not run away, but had been carried away by the devil. She was a witch, and had been one since the age of 7. Some other little girls in the school went into fits at this announcement, and on their recovery confessed that they also were witches. At last the whole of them, to the number of 50, worked upon each other's imaginations to such a degree that they also confessed that they were witches, that they attended the Domdaniel, or meeting of the fiends, that they could ride through the air on broomsticks, feast on infants' flesh, or creep through a keyhole. The citizens of Lille were astounded at these disclosures. The clergy hastened to investigate the matter. Many of them, to their credit, openly expressed their opinion that the whole affair was an imposture. Not so the majority. They strenuously insisted that the confessions of the children were valid, and that it was necessary to make an example by burning them all for witches. The poor parents, alarmed for their offspring, implored the examining Capuchins with tears in their eyes to save their young lives, insisting that they were bewitched and not bewitching. This opinion also gained ground in the town. Antoinette Bourignon, who had put these absurd notions into the heads of the children, was accused of witchcraft and examined before the council. The circumstances of the case seemed so unfavorable towards her that she would not stay for a second examination. Disguising herself as she best could, she hastened out of Lille and escaped pursuit. If she had remained 4 hours longer, she would have been burned by judicial sentence as a witch and a heretic. It is to be hoped that wherever she went, she learned the danger of tampering with youthful minds, and was never again entrusted with the management of children. The Duke of Brunswick and the Elector of Menz were struck with the great cruelty exercised in the torture of suspected persons, and convinced at the same time that no righteous judge would consider a confession extorted by pain, and contradictory in itself, as sufficient evidence to justify the execution of any accused person. It is related of the Duke of Brunswick that he invited 2 learned Jesuits to his house, who were known to entertain strong opinions upon the subject of witchcraft, with a view of showing them the cruelty and absurdity of such practices. A woman lay in the dungeon of the city, accused of witchcraft, and the Duke, having given previous instructions to the officiating torturers, went with the 2 Jesuits to hear her confession. By a series of artful leading questions, the poor creature, in the extremity of her anguish, was induced to confess that she had often attended the Sabbath of the fiends upon the Brocken; that she had seen 2 Jesuits there, who had made themselves notorious, even among witches, for their abominations; that she had seen them assume the form of goats, wolves, and other animals; and that many noted witches had borne them 5, 6, and 7 children at a birth, who had heads like toads and legs like spiders. Being asked if the Jesuits were far from her, she replied that they were in the room beside her. The Duke of Brunswick led his astounded friends away, and explained the stratagem. This was convincing proof to both of them that thousands of persons had suffered unjustly. They knew their own innocence, and shuddered to think what their fate might have been if an enemy, instead of a friend, had put such a confession into the mouth of a criminal. One of these Jesuits was Frederick Spee, the author of the Cautio Criminalis, published in 1631. This work, exposing the horrors of the witch trials, had a most salutary effect in Germany. Schönbrunn, Archbishop and Elector of Menz, abolished the torture entirely within his dominions, and his example was imitated by the Duke of Brunswick and other potentates. The number of supposed witches immediately diminished, and the violence of the mania began to subside. The Elector of Brandenburg issued a rescript in 1654 with respect to the case of Anna of Ellerbrock, a supposed witch, forbidding the use of torture, and stigmatizing the swimming of witches as an unjust, cruel, and deceitful test. This was the beginning of the dawn after the long protracted darkness. The tribunals no longer condemned witches to execution by hundreds in a year. Würzburg, the grand theatre of the burnings, burned but one, where 40 years previously it had burned 80. From 1660 to 1670, the electoral chambers in all parts of Germany constantly commuted the sentence of death passed by the provincial tribunals into imprisonment for life or burning on the cheek. A truer philosophy had gradually disabused the public mind. Learned men freed themselves from the trammels of a debasing superstition, and governments, both civil and ecclesiastical, repressed the popular delusion they had so long encouraged. The Parliament of Normandy condemned a number of women to death in the year 1670 on the old charge of riding on broomsticks to the Domdaniel, but Louis XIV commuted the sentence into banishment for life. The Parliament remonstrated, and sent the king the following remarkable request. The reader will perhaps be glad to see this document at length. It is of importance, as the last effort of a legislative assembly to uphold this great error, and the arguments they used and the instances they quoted are in the highest degree curious. It reflects honour upon the memory of Louis XIV that he was not swayed by it. End of Chapter 2, Part 8. Recording by Linda Johnson. Chapter 2, Part 9 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, Volume 2, Chapter 2, The Witch Mania, Part 9. Request of the Parliament of Rouen to the King in 1670. Quote, Sire, emboldened by the authority which your Majesty has committed into our hands in the province of Normandy, to try and punish offences, and more particularly those offences of the nature of witchcraft, which tend to the destruction of religion and the ruin of nations, we, your Parliament, remonstrate humbly with your Majesty upon certain cases of this kind which have been lately brought before us. We cannot permit the letter addressed by your Majesty's command to the Attorney General of this district for the reprieve of certain persons condemned to death for witchcraft, and for the staying of proceedings in several other cases, to remain unnoticed, and without remarking upon the consequences which may ensue. There is also a letter from your Secretary of State, declaring your Majesty's intention to commute the punishment of these criminals into one of perpetual banishment, and to submit to the opinion of the Procureur General and of the most learned members of the Parliament of Paris whether, in the matter of witchcraft, the jurisprudence of the Parliament of Rouen is to be followed in preference to that of the Parliament of Paris, and of the other parliaments of the kingdom which judge differently. Although by the ordinances of the kings your predecessors, parliaments have been forbidden to pay any attention to l'autre de cachet, we, nevertheless, from the knowledge which we have, in common with the whole kingdom, of the care bestowed by your Majesty for the good of your subjects, and from the submission and obedience to your commandments which we have always manifested, have stayed all proceedings in conformity to your orders, hoping that your Majesty, considering the importance of the crime of witchcraft and the consequences likely to ensue from its impunity, will be graciously pleased to grant us once more your permission to continue the trials and execute judgment upon those found guilty. And as, since we received the letter of your Secretary of State, we have also been made acquainted with the determination of your Majesty not only to commute the sentence of death passed upon these witches into one of perpetual banishment from the province, but to re-establish them in the possession of their goods and chattels, and of their good fame and character, your Parliament have thought it their duty, on occasion of these crimes, the greatest which men can commit, to make you acquainted with the general and uniform feelings of the people of this province with regard to them, it being moreover a question in which are concerned the glory of God and the relief of your suffering subjects, who groan under their fears from the threats and menaces of this sort of persons, and who feel the effects of them every day in the mortal and extraordinary maladies which attack them, and the surprising damage and loss of their possessions. Your Majesty knows well that there is no crime so opposed to the commands of God as witchcraft, which destroys the very foundation of religion, and draws strange abominations after it. It is for this reason, sire, that the Scriptures pronounce the punishment of death against offenders, and that the Church and the Holy Fathers have fulminated their anathemas, and that canonical decisions have one and all decreed the most severe punishments, to deter from this crime, and that the Church of France, animated by the piety of the kings your predecessors, has expressed so great a horror at it, that, not judging the punishment of perpetual imprisonment, the highest it has the power to inflict, sufficiently severe, it has left such criminals to be dealt with by the secular power. It has been the general feeling of all nations that such criminals ought to be condemned to death, and all the ancients were of the same opinion. The law of the 12 Tables, which was the principle of the Roman laws, ordains the same punishment. All jurisconsults agreed in it, as well as the constitutions of the emperors, and more especially those of Constantine and Theodosius, who, enlightened by the Gospel, not only renewed the same punishment, but also deprived expressly all persons found guilty of witchcraft of the right of appeal, and declared them to be unworthy of a prince's mercy. And Charles VIII, sire, inspired by the same sentiments, passed that beautiful and severe ordinance, cette belle et sévère ordonnance, which enjoined the judges to punish witches according to the exigencies of the case, under a penalty of being themselves fined or imprisoned, or dismissed from their office, and decreed at the same time that all persons who refused to denounce a witch should be punished as accomplices, and that all, on the contrary, who gave evidence against one should be rewarded. From these considerations, sire, and in the execution of so holy an ordinance, your parliaments, by their decrees, proportion their punishments to the guilt of the offenders, and your Parliament of Normandy has never, until the present time, found that its practice was different from that of other courts; for all the books which treat upon this matter cite an infinite number of decrees condemning witches to be burnt or broken on the wheel, or to other punishments. The following are examples. In the time of Chilperac, as may be seen in Gregory of Tours, B6, C35 of his History of France, all the decrees of the Parliament of Paris passed according to and in conformity with this ancient jurisprudence of the kingdom, cited by Humbert in his judicial practice. All those cited by Monstrelet in 1459 against the witches of Artois. The decrees of the same Parliament of the 13th of October 1573 against Mary Lefevre, native of Saumur; of the 21st of October 1596 against the Sieur de Beaumont, who pleaded in his defence that he had only sought the aid of the devil for the purpose of unbewitching the afflicted and of curing diseases; of the 4th of July 1606 against Francis Dubose; of the 20th of July 1582 against Abel de la Rue, native of Coulommiers; of the 2nd of October 1593 against Rousseau and his daughter; of 1608 against another Rousseau and one Pelé for witchcraft and adoration of the devil at the Sabbath, under the figure of a he-goat, as confessed by them; the decree of 4th of February 1615 against Leclerc, who appealed from the sentence of the Parliament of Orleans, and who was condemned for having attended the Sabbath, and confessed, as well as two of his accomplices, who died in prison, that he had adored the devil, renounced his baptism and his faith in God, danced the witches' dance, and offered up unholy sacrifices; the decrees of the 6th of May 1616 against a man named Leger, on a similar accusation; the pardon granted by Charles IX. to Trois Echelles upon condition of revealing his accomplices, but afterwards revoked for renewed sorcery on his part; the decree of the Parliament of Paris, cited by Mornac in 1595; the judgments passed in consequence of the commission given by Henry IV. to the Sieur de l'Ancre, councillor of the Parliament of Bordeaux, of the 20th of March 1619 against Etienne Audibert; those passed by the Chamber of Nérac on the 26th of June 1620 against several witches; those passed by the Parliament of Toulouse in 1577, as cited by Gregory Tolosanus, against 400 persons accused of this crime, and who were all marked with the sign of the devil. Besides all these, we might recall to your Majesty's recollection the various decrees of the Parliament of Provence, especially in the case of Gaufredi in 1611, the decrees of the Parliament of Dijon, and those of the Parliament of Rennes, following the example of the condemnation of the Marshal de Rais, who was burned in 1441 for the crime of witchcraft in presence of the Duke of Brittany. All these examples, sire, prove that the accusation of witchcraft has always been punished with death by the parliaments of your kingdom, and justify the uniformity of their practice. These, sire, are the motives upon which your Parliament of Normandy has acted in decreeing the punishment of death against the persons lately brought before it for this crime. If it has happened that, on any occasion, these parliaments, and the Parliament of Normandy among the rest, have condemned the guilty to a less punishment than that of death, it was for the reason that their guilt was not of the deepest dye. Your Majesty and the kings your predecessors, having left full liberty to the various tribunals to whom they delegated the administration of justice, to decree such punishment as was warranted by the evidence brought before them. After so many authorities and punishments ordained by human and divine laws, we humbly supplicate your Majesty to reflect once more upon the extraordinary results which proceed from the malevolence of this sort of people; on the deaths from unknown diseases, which are often the consequences of their menaces; on the loss of the goods and chattels of your subjects; on the proofs of guilt continually afforded by the insensibility of the marks upon the accused; on the sudden transportation of bodies from one place to another; on the sacrifices and nocturnal assemblies, and other facts corroborated by the testimony of ancient and modern authors, and verified by so many eye-witnesses, composed partly of accomplices, and partly of people who had no interest in the trials beyond the love of truth, and confirmed, moreover, by the confessions of the accused parties themselves, and that, sire, with so much agreement and conformity between the different cases, that the most ignorant persons convicted of this crime have spoken to the same circumstances and in nearly the same words as the most celebrated authors who have written about it, all of which may be easily proved to your Majesty's satisfaction by the records of various trials before your parliaments. These, sire, are truths so intimately bound up with the principles of our religion that, extraordinary although they be, no person has been able to this time to call them in question. If some have cited in opposition to these truths the pretended canon of the Council of Ancyre and a passage from St. Augustin in a treatise upon the spirit and the soul, it has been without foundation, and it would be easy to convince your Majesty that neither the one nor the other ought to be accounted of any authority, and, besides that, the canon in this sense would be contrary to the opinion of all succeeding councils of the Church. Cardinal Baronius and all learned commentators agree that it is not to be found in any old edition. In effect, in those editions wherein it is found, it is in another language, and is in direct contradiction to the 23rd canon of the same council, which condemns sorcery according to all preceding constitutions. Even supposing that this canon was really promulgated by the Council of Ancyre, we must observe that it was issued in the 2nd century, when the principal attention of the Church was directed to the destruction of paganism. For this reason, it condemns that class of women who said they could pass through the air and over immense regions, with Diana and Herodias, and enjoins all preachers to teach the falsehood of such an opinion, in order to deter people from the worship of these false divinities. But it does not question the power of the devil over the human body, which is, in fact, proved by the holy gospel of Jesus Christ himself. And with regard, sire, to the pretended passage of St. Augustin, everybody knows that it was not written by him, because the writer, whoever he was, cites Boëtius, who died more than 80 years after the time of St. Augustin. Besides, there is still more convincing proof in the fact that the same father establishes the truth of witchcraft in all his writings, and more particularly in his City of God, and in his first volume, Question the 25th, wherein he states that sorcery is a communion between man and the devil, which all good Christians ought to look upon with horror. Taking all these things into consideration, sire, the officers of your Parliament hope, from the justice of your Majesty, that you will be graciously pleased to receive the humble remonstrances they have taken the liberty to make. They are compelled, for the acquittal of their own consciences, and in discharge of their duty, to make known to your Majesty that the decrees they passed against the sorcerers and witches brought before them were passed after a mature deliberation on the part of all the judges present, and that nothing has been done therein which is not conformable to the universal jurisprudence of the kingdom, and for the general welfare of your Majesty's subjects, of whom there is not one who can say that he is secure from the malevolence of such criminals. We therefore supplicate your Majesty to suffer us to carry into effect the sentences we passed, and to proceed with the trial of the other persons accused of the same crime, and that the piety of your Majesty will not suffer to be introduced during your reign an opinion contrary to the principles of that holy religion for which you have always employed so gloriously both your cares and your arms." End quote. Louis, as we have already mentioned, paid no attention to this appeal. The lives of the old women were spared, and prosecutions for mere witchcraft, unconnected with other offences, were discontinued throughout France. In 1680, an act was passed for the punishment not of witches, but of pretenders to witchcraft, fortune-tellers, divineresses, and poisoners. Thus the light broke in upon Germany, France, England, and Scotland about the same time, gradually growing clearer and clearer till the middle of the 18th century, when witchcraft was finally reckoned amongst exploded doctrines, and the belief in it confined to the uttermost vulgar. Twice, however, did the madness burst forth again as furious, while it lasted, as ever it had been. The first time in Sweden, in 1669, and the second in Germany so late as 1749. Both these instances merit particular mention. The first is one of the most extraordinary upon record. and for atrocity and absurdity, is unsurpassed in the annals of any nation. Louis XIV. It having been reported to the King of Sweden that the little village of Mora, in the province of Dalecarlia, was troubled exceedingly with witches, he appointed a commission of clergy and laymen to trace the rumour to its source, with full powers to punish the guilty. On the 12th of August, 1669, the commissioners arrived in the bewitched village, to the great joy of the credulous inhabitants. On the following day, the whole population, amounting to 3,000 persons, assembled in the church. A sermon was preached, "declaring the miserable case of those people that suffered themselves to be deluded by the devil," and fervent prayer was offered up that God would remove the scourge from among them. The whole assembly then adjourned to the rector's house, filling all the street before it, when the king's commission was read, charging every person who knew anything of the witchery to come forward and declare the truth. A passion of tears seized upon the multitude. Men, women, and children began to weep and sob, and all promised to divulge what they had heard or knew. In this frame of mind they were dismissed to their homes. On the following day they were again called together, when the depositions of several persons were taken publicly before them all. The result was that 70 persons, including 15 children, were taken into custody. Numbers also were arrested in the neighbouring district of Elfdale. Being put to the torture, they all confessed their guilt. They said they used to go to a gravel pit that lay hard by the crossway, where they put a vest upon their heads and danced round and round and round about. They then went to the crossway and called 3 times upon the devil, the first time in a low, still voice, the second somewhat louder, and the third very loudly, with these words: "Antecessor, come and carry us to Blockula." This invocation never failed to bring him to their view. He generally appeared as a little old man, in a grey coat, with red and blue stockings, with exceedingly long garters. He had besides a very high-crowned hat, with bands of many-coloured linen enfolded about it, and a long red beard that hung down to his middle. The first question he put to them was, whether they would serve him soul and body. On their answering in the affirmative, he told them to make ready for the journey to Blockula. It was necessary to procure, in the first place, "some scrapings of altars and filings of church clocks." Antecessor then gave them a horn with some salve in it, wherewith they anointed themselves. These preparations ended, he brought beasts for them to ride upon, horses, asses, goats, and monkeys, and giving them a saddle, a hammer, and a nail, uttered the word of command, and away they went. Nothing stopped them. They flew over churches, high walls, rocks, and mountains, until they came to the green meadow where Blockula was situated. Upon these occasions they carried as many children with them as they could, for the devil, they said, "did plague and whip them if they did not procure him children, insomuch that they had no peace or quiet for him." Many parents corroborated a part of this evidence, stating that their children had repeatedly told them that they had been carried away in the night to Blockula, where the devil had beaten them black and blue. They had seen the marks in the morning, but they soon disappeared. One little girl was examined, who swore positively that she was carried through the air by the witches, and when at a great height she uttered the holy name of Jesus. She immediately fell to the ground, and made a great hole in her side. "The devil, however, picked her up, healed her side, and carried her away to Blockula." She added, and her mother confirmed her statement, that she had till that day an exceedingly great pain in her side. This was a clencher, and the nail of conviction was driven home to the hearts of the judges. The place called Blockula, Whither they were carried was a large house with a gate to it, "in a delicate meadow, whereof they could see no end." There was a very long table in it, at which the witches sat down, and in other rooms "there were very lovely and delicate beds for them to sleep upon." After a number of ceremonies had been performed by which they bound themselves body and soul to the service of Antecessor, they sat down to a feast composed of broth, made of colworts and bacon, oatmeal, bread and butter, milk and cheese. The devil always took the chair, and sometimes played to them on the harp or the fiddle while they were eating. After dinner they danced in a ring, sometimes naked, and sometimes in their clothes, cursing and swearing all the time. Some of the women added particulars too horrible and too obscene for repetition. Once the devil pretended to be dead, that he might see whether his people regretted him. They instantly set up a loud wail, and wept 3 tears each for him, at which he was so pleased that he jumped up among them, and hugged in his arms those who had been most obstreperous in their sorrow. Such were the principal details given by the children, and corroborated by the confessions of the full-grown witches. Anything more absurd was never before stated in a court of justice. Many of the accused contradicted themselves most palpably, but the commissioners gave no heed to discrepancies. One of them, the parson of the district, stated in the course of the inquiry that on a particular night which he mentioned he had been afflicted with a headache so agonizing that he could not account for it otherwise than by supposing he was bewitched. In fact, he thought a score of witches must have been dancing on the crown of his head. This announcement excited great horror among the pious dames of the auditory, who loudly expressed their wonder that the devil should have power to hurt so good a man. One poor witch, who lay in the very jaws of death, confessed that she knew too well the cause of the minister's headache. The devil had sent her with a sledge-hammer and a large nail to drive into the good man's skull. She had hammered at it for some time, but the skull was so enormously thick that she made no impression upon it. Every hand was held up in astonishment. The pious minister blessed God that his skull was so solid, and he became renowned for his thick head all the days of his life. Whether the witch intended a joke does not appear, but she was looked upon as a criminal more than usually atrocious. 70 persons were condemned to death on these so awful yet so ridiculous confessions. 23 of them were burned together in one fire in the village of Mora, in the presence of thousands of delighted spectators. On the following day, 15 children were murdered in the same manner, offered up in sacrifice to the bloody Moloch of superstition. The remaining 32 were executed at the neighboring town of Faluna. Besides these, 56 children were found guilty of witchcraft in a minor degree, and sentenced to various punishments, such as running the gauntlet, imprisonment, and public whipping once a week for a 12-month. Long after the occurrence of this case, it was cited as one of the most convincing proofs upon record of the prevalence of witchcraft. When men wish to construct or support a theory, how they torture facts into their service. The lying whimsies of a few sick children, encouraged by foolish parents and drawn out by superstitious neighbors, were sufficient to set a country in a flame. If, instead of commissioners as deeply sunk in the slough of ignorance as the people they were sent amongst, there had been deputed a few men firm in courage and clear in understanding, how different would have been the result! Some of the poor children who were burned would have been sent to an infirmary, others would have been well flogged. The credulity of the parents would have been laughed at, and the lives of 70 persons spared. The belief in witchcraft remains in Sweden to this day, but happily The annals of that country present no more such instances of lamentable aberration of intellect as the one just cited. End of Chapter 2, Part 9. Recording by Linda Johnson.
Chapter 2, Part 10 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay. Volume 2, Chapter 2, The Witch Mania, Part 10. In New England, about the same time, the colonists were scared by similar stories of the antics of the devil. All at once a fear seized upon the multitude, and supposed criminals were arrested day after day in such numbers that the prisons were found too small to contain them. A girl named Goodwin, the daughter of a mason, who was hypochondriac and subject to fits, imagined that an old Irish woman named Glover had bewitched her. Her two brothers, in whose constitutions there was apparently a predisposition to similar fits, went off in the same way, crying out that the devil and Dame Glover were tormenting them. At times their joints were so stiff that they could not be moved, while at others, said the neighbours, they were so flexible that the bones appeared softened into sinews. The supposed witch was seized, and as she could not repeat the Lord's Prayer without making a mistake in it, she was condemned and executed. But the popular excitement was not allayed. One victim was not enough. The people waited agape for new disclosures. Suddenly 2 hysteric girls in another family fell into fits daily, and the cry of witchcraft resounded from one end of the colony to the other. The feeling of suffocation in the throat, so common in cases of hysteria, was said by the patients to be caused by the devil himself, who had stuck balls in the windpipe to choke them. They felt the pricking of thorns in every part of the body, and one of them vomited needles. The case of these girls, who were the daughter and niece of a Mr. Parvis, the minister of a Calvinist chapel, excited so much attention that all the weak women in the colony began to fancy themselves similarly afflicted. The more they brooded on it, the more convinced they became. The contagion of this mental disease was as great as if it had been a pestilence. One after the other the women fainted away, asserting on their recovery that they had seen the spectres of witches. Where there were 3 or 4 girls in a family, they so worked each upon the diseased imagination of the other, that they fell into fits 5 or 6 times in a day. Some related that the devil himself appeared to them, bearing in his hand a parchment roll, and promising that if they would sign an agreement transferring to him their immortal souls, they should be immediately relieved from fits and all the ills of the flesh. Others asserted that they saw witches only, who made them similar promises, threatening that they should never be free from aches and pains till they had agreed to become the devils. When they refused, the witches pinched, or bit, or pricked them with long pins and needles. More than 200 persons named by these mischievous visionaries were thrown into prison. They were of all ages and conditions of life, and many of them of exemplary character. No less than 19 were condemned and executed before reason returned to the minds of the colonists. The most horrible part of this lamentable history is, that among the victims there was a little child only 5 years old. Some women swore that they had seen it repeatedly in company with the devil, and that it had bitten them often with its little teeth for refusing to sign a compact with the evil one. It can hardly increase our feelings of disgust and abhorrence when we learn that this insane community actually tried and executed a dog for the same offence. One man named Corey stoutly refused to plead to the preposterous indictment against him. As was the practice in such cases, he was pressed to death. It is told of the sheriff of New England, who superintended the execution, that when this unhappy man thrust out his tongue in his mortal agony, he seized hold of a cane and crammed it back again into the mouth. If ever there were a fiend in human form, it was this sheriff, a man who, if the truth were known, perhaps plumed himself upon his piety, thought he was doing God good service, and hoped to merit heaven by making earth a hell. Arguing still in the firm belief of witchcraft, the bereaved people began to inquire, when they saw their dearest friends snatched away from them by these wide-spreading accusations, whether the whole proceedings were not carried on by the agency of the devil. Might not the great enemy have put false testimony into the mouths of the witnesses, or might not the witnesses be witches themselves? Every man who was in danger of losing his wife, his child, or his sister embraced this doctrine with avidity. The revulsion was as sudden as the first frenzy. All at once the colonists were convinced of their error. The judges put a stop to the prosecutions, even of those who had confessed their guilt. The latter were no sooner at liberty than they retracted all they had said, and the greater number hardly remembered the avowals which agony had extorted from them. 8 persons who had been tried and condemned were set free, and gradually girls ceased to have fits, and to talk of the persecutions of the devil. The judge who had condemned the first criminal executed on this charge was so smitten with sorrow and humiliation at his folly, that he set apart the anniversary of that day as one of solemn penitence and fasting. He still clung to the belief in witchcraft. No new light had broken in upon him on that subject, but happily for the community the delusion had taken a merciful turn. The whole colony shared the feeling. The jurors on the different trials openly expressed their penitence in the churches, and those who had suffered were regarded as the victims, and not as the accomplices of Satan. It is related that the Indian tribes in New England were sorely puzzled at the infatuation of the settlers, and thought them either a race inferior to, or more sinful than, the French colonists in the vicinity, amongst whom, as they remarked, the Great Spirit sent no witches. Returning again to the continent of Europe, we find that after the year 1680 men became still wiser upon this subject. For 20 years the populace were left to their belief, but governments in general gave it no aliment in the shape of executions. The edict of Louis XIV gave a blow to the superstition, from which it never recovered. The last execution in the Protestant cantons of Switzerland was at Geneva in 1652. The various potentates of Germany, although they could not stay the trials, invariably commuted the sentence into imprisonment in all cases where the pretended witch was accused of pure witchcraft, unconnected with any other crime. In the year 1701, Thomasius, the learned professor at the University of Halle, delivered his inaugural thesis, De Crimine Magicae, which struck another blow at the falling monster of popular error. But a faith so strong as that in witchcraft was not to be eradicated at once. The arguments of learned men did not penetrate to the villages and hamlets, but still they achieved great things. They rendered the belief an unworking faith, and prevented the supply of victims, on which for so many ages it had fattened and grown strong. Once more the delusion broke out like a wild beast wounded to the death. It collected all its remaining energies for the final convulsion, which was to show how mighty it had once been. Germany, which had nursed the frightful error in its cradle, tended it on its deathbed, and Würzburg, the scene of so many murders on the same pretext, was destined to be the scene of the last. That it might lose no portion of its bad renown, the last murder was as atrocious as the first. The case offers a great resemblance to that of the witches of Moira in New England, except in the number of its victims. It happened so late as the year 1749, to the astonishment and disgust of the rest of Europe. A number of young women in a convent at Würzburg fancied themselves bewitched. They felt, like all hysteric subjects, a sense of suffocation in the throat. They went into fits repeatedly, and one of them, who had swallowed needles, evacuated them at abscesses which formed in different parts of the body. The cry of sorcery was raised, and a young woman named Maria Renata Sanger was arrested on the charge of having leagued with the devil to bewitch 5 of the young ladies. It was sworn on the trial that Maria had been frequently seen to clamber over the convent walls in the shape of a pig, that proceeding to the cellar she used to drink the best wine till she was intoxicated, and then start suddenly up in her own form. Other girls asserted that she used to prowl about the roof like a cat, and often penetrate into their chamber and frighten them by her dreadful howlings. It was also said that she had been seen in the shape of a hare, milking the cows dry in the meadows belonging to the convent; that she used to perform as an actress on the boards of Drury Lane Theatre in London, and on the very same night return upon a broomstick to Würzburg, and afflict the young ladies with pains in all their limbs. Upon this evidence she was condemned and burned alive in the market place of Würzburg. Here ends this frightful catalogue of murder and superstition. Since that day, belief in witchcraft has fled from the populous abodes of men, and taken refuge in remote villages and districts too wild, rugged, and inhospitable to afford a resting place for the foot of civilization. Rude fishers and uneducated labourers still attribute every phenomenon of nature which they cannot account for to the devil and witches. Catalepsy, that wondrous disease, is still thought by ignorant gossips to be the work of Satan; and hypochondriacs, uninformed by science of the nature of their malady, devoutly believe in the reality of their visions. The reader would hardly credit the extent of the delusion upon this subject in the very heart of England at this day. Many an old woman leads a life of misery from the unfeeling insults of her neighbours, who raise the scornful finger and hooting voice at her, because in her decrepitude she is ugly, spiteful, perhaps insane, and realizes in her personal appearance the description preserved by tradition of the witches of yore. Even in the neighbourhood of great towns the taint remains of this once widely spread contagion. If no victims fall beneath it, the enlightenment of the law is all that prevents a recurrence of scenes as horrid as those of the 17th century. Hundreds upon hundreds of witnesses could be found to swear to absurdities as great as those asserted by the infamous Matthew Hopkins. In the Annual Register for 1760, an instance of the belief in witchcraft is related which shows how superstition lingers. A dispute arose in the little village of Glen, in Leicestershire, between two old women, each of whom vehemently accused the other of witchcraft. The quarrel at last ran so high that a challenge ensued, and they both agreed to be tried by the ordeal of swimming. They accordingly stripped to their shifts, procured some men who tied their thumbs and great toes together crosswise, and then, with a cart rope about their middles, suffered themselves to be thrown into a pool of water. One of them sank immediately, but the other continued struggling a short time upon the surface of the water, which the mob, deeming an infallible sign of her guilt, pulled her out, and insisted she should immediately impeach all her accomplices in the craft. She accordingly told them that in the neighbouring village of Burton there were several old women as much witches as she was. Happily for her, this negative information was deemed sufficient, and a student in astrology, or white witch, coming up at the time, the mob by his direction proceeded forthwith to Burton in search of all the delinquents. After a little consultation on their arrival, they went to the old woman's house, on whom they had fixed the strongest suspicion. The poor old creature on their approach locked the outer door, and from the window of an upstairs room asked what they wanted. They informed her that she was charged with being guilty of witchcraft, and that they were come to duck her, remonstrating with her at the same time upon the necessity of submission to the ordeal, that if she were innocent all the world might know it. Upon her persisting in a positive refusal to come down, they broke open the door, and carried her out by force to a deep gravel pit full of water. They tied her thumbs and toes together, and threw her into the water, where they kept her for several minutes, drawing her out, and in 2 or 3 times by the rope round her middle. Not being able to satisfy themselves whether she were a witch or no, they at last let her go, or, more properly speaking, they left her on the bank to walk home by herself if she ever recovered. Next day they tried the same experiment upon another woman, and afterwards upon a third. But fortunately neither of these victims lost her life from this brutality. Many of the ringleaders in the outrage were apprehended during the week, and tried before the justices at quarter sessions. 2 of them were sentenced to stand in the pillory and to be imprisoned for a month, and as many as 20 more were fined in small sums for the assault, and bound over to keep the peace for a 12-month. So late as the year 1785, says Arnaud in his collection and abridgment of criminal trials in Scotland, it was the custom among the sect of seceders to read from the pulpit an annual confession of sins, national and personal, amongst the former of which was particularly mentioned the repeal by Parliament of the penal statute against witches, contrary to the express laws of God. Many houses are still to be found in England with the horseshoe, the grand preservative against witchcraft, nailed against the threshold. If any overwise philosopher should attempt to remove them, the chances are that he would have more broken bones than thanks for his interference. Let any man walk into Cross Street, Hatton Garden, and from thence into Bleeding Heart Yard, and learn the tales still told and believed of one house in that neighbourhood, and he will ask himself in astonishment if such things can be in the 19th century. The witchcraft of Lady Hatton, the wife of the famous Sir Christopher, so renowned for his elegant dancing in the days of Elizabeth, is as devoutly believed as the Gospels. The room is to be seen where the devil seized her after the expiration of the contract he had made with her, and bore her away bodily to the pit of Tophet. The pump against which he dashed her is still pointed out, and the spot where her heart was found after he had torn it out of her bosom with his iron claws has received the name of Bleeding Heart Yard in confirmation of the story. Whether the horseshoe still remains upon the door of the haunted house to keep away other witches is uncertain. A former inmate relates that about 20 years ago more than one old woman begged for admittance repeatedly to satisfy themselves that it was in its proper place. One poor creature, apparently insane and clothed in rags, came to the door with a tremendous double knock, as loud as that of a fashionable footman, and walked straight along the passage to the horseshoe. Great was the wonderment of the inmates, especially when the woman spat upon the horseshoe and expressed her sorrow that she could do no harm while it remained there. After spitting upon and kicking it again and again, she coolly turned round and left the house, without saying a word to anybody. This poor creature perhaps intended a joke, but the probability is that she imagined herself a witch. In Saffron Hill, where she resided, her ignorant neighbours gave her that character, and looked upon her with no little fear and aversion. More than one example of the popular belief in witchcraft occurred in the neighbourhood of Hastings so lately as the year 1830. An aged woman who resided in the rope walk of that town was so repulsive in her appearance that she was invariably accused of being a witch by all the ignorant people who knew her. She was bent completely double, and though very old, her eye was unusually bright and malignant. She wore a red cloak, and supported herself on a crutch. She was to all outward appearance the very beau ideal of a witch. So dear is power to the human heart that this old woman actually encouraged the popular superstition. She took no pains to remove the ill impression, but seemed to delight that she, old and miserable as she was, could keep in awe so many happier and stronger fellow creatures. Timid girls crouched with fear when they met her, and many would go a mile out of their way to avoid her. Like the witches of the olden times, she was not sparing of her curses against those who offended her. The child of a woman who resided within 2 doors of her was afflicted with lameness, and the mother constantly asserted that the old woman had bewitched her. All the neighbours credited the tale. It was believed, too, that she could assume the form of a cat. Many a harmless puss has been hunted almost to death by mobs of men and boys, upon the supposition that the animal would start up before them in the true shape of Mother Blank. In the same town there resided a fisherman, who was the object of unceasing persecution, because it was said that he had sold himself to the devil. It was currently reported that he could creep through a keyhole, and that he had made a witch of his daughter in order that he might have the more power over his fellows. It was also believed that he could sit on the points of pins and needles and feel no pain. His brother fishermen put him to this test whenever they had an opportunity. In the alehouses which he frequented they often placed long needles in the cushions of the chairs in such a manner that he could not fail to pierce himself when he sat down. The result of these experiments tended to confirm their faith in his supernatural powers. It was asserted that he never flinched. Such was the popular feeling in the fashionable town of Hastings a few years ago. Very probably it is the same now. In the north of England the superstition lingers to an almost inconceivable extent. Lancashire abounds with witch doctors, a set of quacks who pretend to cure diseases inflicted by the devil. The practices of these worthies may be judged of by the following case, reported in the Hereford Reformer of the 23rd of June, 1838. The witch doctor alluded to is better known by the name the Cunning Man, and has a large practice in the counties of Lincoln and Nottingham. According to the writer in the Reformer, the dupe, whose name is not mentioned, had been for about 2 years afflicted with a painful abscess, and had been prescribed for without relief by more than one medical gentleman. He was urged by some of his friends, not only in his own village, but in neighbouring ones, to consult the witch doctor, as they were convinced he was under some evil influence. He agreed, and sent his wife to the Cunning Man, who lived in New St. Swithins in Lincoln. She was informed by this ignorant impostor that her husband's disorder was an infliction of the devil, occasioned by his next door neighbours, who had made use of certain charms for that purpose. From the description he gave of the process, it appears to be the same as that employed by Dr. Fian and Gellie Duncan to work woe upon King James. He stated that the neighbours, instigated by a witch whom he pointed out, took some wax and moulded it before the fire into the form of her husband, as near as they could represent him. They then pierced the image with pins on all sides, repeated the Lord's Prayer backwards, and offered prayers to the devil that he would fix his stings into the person whom that figure represented, in like manner as they pierced it with pins. To counteract the effects of this diabolical process, the witch doctor prescribed a certain medicine, and a charm to be worn next to the body, on that part where the disease principally lay. The patient was to repeat the 109th and 119th Psalms every day, or the cure would not be effectual. The fee which he claimed for this advice was a guinea. So efficacious is faith in the cure of any malady, that the patient actually felt much better after a 3 weeks' course of this prescription. The notable charm which the quack had given was afterwards opened, and found to be a piece of parchment, covered with some cabalistic characters and signs of the planets. The next door neighbours were in great alarm that the witch doctor would, on the solicitation of the recovering patient, employ some means to punish them for their pretended witchcraft. To escape the infliction, they seed another cunning man in Nottinghamshire, who told them of a similar charm, which would preserve them from all the malice of their enemies. The writer concludes by saying that the doctor, not long after he had been thus consulted, wrote to say that he had discovered that his patient was not afflicted by Satan, as he had imagined, but by God, and would continue more or less in the same state till his life's end. An impostor carried on a similar trade in the neighbourhood of Tunbridge Wells about the year 1830. He had been in practice for several years, and charged enormous fees for his advice. This fellow pretended to be the seventh son of a seventh son, and to be endowed in consequence with miraculous powers for the cure of all diseases, but especially of those resulting from witchcraft. It was not only the poor who employed him, but ladies who rode in their carriages. He was often sent for from a distance of 60 or 70 miles by these people, who paid all his expenses to and fro, besides rewarding him handsomely. He was about 80 years of age, and his extremely venerable appearance aided his imposition in no slight degree. His name was Oki, or Oakley. In France, the superstition at this day is even more prevalent than it is in England. Guériney, in his History of Magic and Sorcery in that country, cites upwards of 20 instances which occurred between the years 1805 and 1818. In the latter year no less than 3 tribunals were occupied with trials originating in this humiliating belief. We shall cite only one of them. Julien de Bourdes, aged 53, a mason, an inhabitant of the village of Thilouse, near Bordeaux, was taken suddenly ill in the month of January 1818. As he did not know how to account for his malady, he suspected at last that he was bewitched. He communicated this suspicion to his son-in-law Bridier, and they both went to consult a sort of idiot named Baudouin, who passed for a conjurer or white witch. This man told them that de Bourdes was certainly bewitched, and offered to accompany them to the house of an old man named Renard, who he said was undoubtedly the criminal. On the night of the 23rd of January, all 3 proceeded stealthily to the dwelling of Renard, and accused him of afflicting persons with diseases by the aid of the devil. De Bourdes fell on his knees and earnestly entreated to be restored to his former health, promising that he would take no measures against him for the evil he had done. The old man denied in the strongest terms that he was a wizard, and when De Bourdes still pressed him to remove the spell from him, he said he knew nothing about the spell, and refused to remove it. The idiot Baudouin, the white witch, now interfered, and told his companions that no relief for the malady could ever be procured until the old man confessed his guilt. To force him to confession, they lighted some sticks of sulphur which they had brought with them for the purpose, and placed them under the old man's nose. In a few moments he fell down suffocated and apparently lifeless. They were all greatly alarmed, and thinking that they had killed the man, they carried him out and threw him into a neighbouring pond, hoping to make it appear that he had fallen in accidentally. The pond, however, was not very deep, and the coolness of the water reviving the old man, he opened his eyes and sat up. De Bourdes and Bridier, who were still waiting on the bank, were now more alarmed than before, lest he should recover and inform against them. They therefore waded into the pond, seized their victim by the hair of the head, beat him severely, and then held him under water till he was drowned. They were all three apprehended on the charge of murder a few days afterwards. Dubourg and Bridier were found guilty of aggravated manslaughter only, and sentenced to be burnt on the back, and to work in the galleys for life. The white witch, Baudouin, was acquitted on the ground of insanity. M. Garnet further informs us that France at the time he wrote, 1818, was overrun by a race of fellows who made a trade of casting out devils and finding out witches. He adds also that many of the priests in the rural districts encouraged the superstition of their parishioners by resorting frequently to exorcism whenever any foolish persons took it into their heads that a spell had been thrown over them. He recommended as a remedy for the evil that all these exorcists, whether lay or clerical, should be sent to the galleys, and felt assured that the number of witches would then very sensibly diminish. Many other instances of this lingering belief might be cited in both France and Great Britain, and indeed in every other country in Europe. So deeply rooted are some errors that ages cannot remove them. The poisonous tree that once overshadowed the land may be cut down by the sturdy efforts of sages and philosophers. The sun may shine clearly upon spots where venomous things once nestled in security and shade, but still the entangled roots are stretched beneath the surface, and may be found by those who dig. Another king like James I. might make them vegetate again, and more mischievous still, another pope like Innocent VIII. Might raise the decaying roots to strength and verdure. Still it is consoling to think that the delirium has passed away, that the raging madness has given place to a milder folly, and that we may now count by units the votaries of a superstition which in former ages numbered its victims by tens of thousands, and its votaries by millions. End of Chapter 2, Part 10. Recording by Philip Gould.
Chapter 3, Part 1 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Markgraf. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, Volume 2, Chapter 3, The Slow Poisoners, Part 1. Pescata. The like was never read of. Stephano. In my judgment, to all that shall but hear it, 'twill appear a most impossible fable. Pescata. Truth, I tell you, and briefly as I can, by what degrees they fell into this madness. Duke of Milan. The atrocious system of poisoning by poisons so slow in their operation as to make the victim appear to ordinary observers as if dying from a gradual decay of nature has been practiced in all ages. Those who are curious in the matter may refer to Beckmann on secret poisons in his History of Inventions, in which he has collected several instances of it from the Greek and Roman writers. Early in the 16th century, the crime seems to have gradually increased, till in the 17th it spread over Europe like a pestilence. It was often exercised by pretended witches and sorcerers, and finally became a branch of education amongst all who laid any claim to magical and supernatural arts. In the 21st year of Henry VIII, an act was passed rendering it high treason. Those found guilty of it were to be boiled to death. One of the first in point of date, and hardly second to any in point of atrocity, is the murder by this means of Sir Thomas Overbury, which disgraced the court of James I in the year 1613. A slight sketch of it will be a fitting introduction to the history of the poisoning mania which was so prevalent in France and Italy 50 years later. Robert Kerr, a Scottish youth, was early taken notice of by James I, and loaded with honours, for no other reason that the world could ever discover than the beauty of his person. James, even in his own day, was suspected of being addicted to the most abominable of all offences. And the more we examine his history now, the stronger the suspicion becomes. However that may be, the handsome Kerr, lending his smooth cheek, even in public, to the disgusting kisses of his royal master, rose rapidly in favour. In the year 1613 he was made Lord High Treasurer of Scotland, and created an English peer by the style and title of Viscount Rochester. Still further honours were in store for him. In this rapid promotion, he had not been without a friend. Sir Thomas Overby, the king's secretary, who appears, for some threats in his own letters, to have been no better than a pander to the vices of the king and privy to his dangerous secrets, exerted all his backstair influence to forward the promotion of Kerr, by whom he was doubtless repaid in some way or other. Overby did not confine his friendship to this, if friendship ever could exist between two such men, but acted in the part of an entremetteur, and assisted Rochester to carry on an adulterous intrigue with the Lady Frances Howard, the wife of the Earl of Essex. This woman was a person of violent passions, and lost to all sense of shame. Her husband was in her way, and to be freed from him she instituted proceedings for a divorce on grounds which a woman of any modesty or delicacy of feeling would die rather than avow. Her scandalous suit was successful, and was no sooner decided than preparations on a scale of the greatest magnificence were made for her marriage with Lord Rochester. Sir Thomas Overby, who had willingly assisted his patron to intrigue with the Countess of Essex, seems to have imagined that his marriage with so vile a woman might retard his advancement. He accordingly employed all his influence to dissuade him from it, but Rochester was bent on the match, and his passions were as violent as those of the Countess. On one occasion, when Overby and the Viscount were walking in the gallery of Whitehall, Overby was overheard to say, "Well, my lord, if you do marry that base woman, you will utterly ruin your honor and yourself. You shall never do it with my advice or consent, and if you do, you had best look to stand fast." Rochester flung from him in a rage, exclaiming with an oath, "I will be even with you for this." These words were the death warrant of the unfortunate Overby. He had mortally wounded the pride of Rochester in insinuating that by his, Overby's, means he might be lowered in the king's favor, and he had endeavored to curb the burning passions of a heartless, dissolute, and reckless man. Overby's imprudent remonstrances were reported to the Countess, and from that moment she also vowed the most deadly vengeance against him. With a fiendish hypocrisy, however, they both concealed their intentions, and Overby, at the solicitation of Rochester, was appointed ambassador to the court of Russia. This apparent favor was but the first step in a deep and deadly plot. Rochester, pretending to be warmly attached to the interests of Overby, advised him to refuse the embassy, which he said was but a trick to get him out of the way. He promised at the same time to stand between him and any evil consequences which might result from his refusal. Overby fell into the snare and declined the embassy. James, offended, immediately ordered his committal to the Tower. He was now in safe custody, and his enemies had opportunity to commence the work of vengeance. The first thing Rochester did was to procure, by his influence at court, the dismissal of the lieutenant of the Tower, and the appointment of Sir Jarvis Elwes, one of his creatures, to the vacant post. This man was but one instrument, and another, being necessary, was found in Richard Weston, a fellow who had formerly been shopman to a druggist. He was installed in the office of underkeeper, and as such had the direct custody of Overby. So far all was favorable to the designs of the conspirators. In the meantime, the insidious Rochester wrote the most friendly letters to Overby, requesting him to bear his ill fortune patiently, and promising that his imprisonment should not be of long duration, for that his friends were exerting themselves to soften the king's displeasure. Still pretending the extreme of sympathy for him, he followed up the letters by presents of pastry and other delicacies, which could not be procured in the Tower. These articles were all poisoned. Occasionally, presents of a similar description were sent to Sir Jarvis Elwes, with the understanding that these articles were not poisoned when they were unaccompanied by letters. Of these, the unfortunate prisoner never tasted. A woman named Turner, who had formerly kept a house of ill fame, and who had more than once lent it to further the guilty intercourse of Rochester and Lady Essex, was the agent employed to procure the poisons. They were prepared by Dr. Foreman, a pretended fortune-teller of Lambeth, assisted by an apothecary named Franklin. Both of these persons knew for what purposes the poisons were needed, and employed their skill in mixing them in the pastry and other edibles in such small quantities as gradually to wear out the constitution of their victim. Mrs. Turner regularly furnished the poisoned articles to the underkeeper, who placed them before Overby. Not only his food, but his drink was poisoned. Arsenic was mixed with the salt he ate, and cantharides with the pepper. All this time his health declined sensibly. Daily he grew weaker and weaker, and with a sickly appetite craved for sweets and jellies. Rochester continued to condole with him, and anticipated all his wants in this respect, sending him abundance of pastry, and occasionally partridges and other game, and young pigs. With the sauce for the game, Mrs. Turner mixed a quantity of cantharides and poisoned the pork with lunar caustic. As stated on the trial, Overby took in this manner poison enough to have poisoned 20 men. But his constitution was strong, and he still lingered. Franklin, the apothecary, confessed that he prepared with Dr. Foreman 7 different sorts of poison, viz., aquafortis, arsenic, mercury, powder of diamonds, lunar caustic, great spiders, and cantharides. Overby held out so long that Rochester became impatient, and in a letter to Lady Essex expressed his wonder that things were not sooner dispatched. Orders were immediately sent by Lady Essex to the keeper to finish with the victim at once. Overby had not been all this time without suspicion of treachery, although he appears to have had no idea of poison. He merely suspected that it was intended to confine him for life, and to set the king still more bitterly against him. In one of his letters he threatened Rochester that unless he were speedily liberated, he would expose his villainy to the world. He says, "You and I, ere it be long, will come to a public trial of another nature. Drive me not to extremities, lest I should say something that both you and I should repent. Whether I live or die, your shame will never die, but ever remain to the world, to make you the most odious man living. I wonder much you should neglect him to whom such secrets of all kinds have passed. Be these the fruits of common secrets, common dangers?" Sir Thomas Overby. All these remonstrances and hints as to the dangerous secrets in his keeping were ill calculated to serve him with a man so reckless as Lord Rochester. They were more likely to cause him to be sacrificed than to be saved. Rochester appears to have acted as if he thought so. He doubtless employed the murderer's reasoning that dead men tell no tales, and whether receiving letters of his description, he complained to his paramour of the delay. Weston was spurred on to consummate the atrocity, and the patience of all parties being exhausted, a dose of corrosive sublimate was administered to him in October 1613, which put an end to his sufferings, after he had been for 6 months in their hands. On the very day of his death, and before his body was cold, he was wrapped up carelessly in a sheet and buried without any funeral ceremony in a pit within the precincts of the Tower. Sir Anthony Weldon, in his Court and Character of James I, gives a somewhat different account of the closing scene of this tragedy. He says, "Franklin and Weston came into Overby's chamber and found him in infinite torment, with contention between the strength of nature and the working of the poison. And it became very like that nature, and gotten the better of his contention by the thrusting out of boils, blotches, and blains, they, fearing it might come to light by the judgment of physicians, the foul play that had been offered him, consented to stifle him with the bedclothes, which accordingly was performed, and so ended his miserable life, with the assurance of the conspirators that he died by the poison, none thinking otherwise than these 2 murderers." The sudden death, the indecent haste of the funeral, and the non-holding of an inquest upon the body strengthened the suspicions that were afloat. Rumor, instead of whispering, began to speak out, and the relatives of the deceased openly expressed their belief that their kinsman had been murdered. But Rochester was still all-powerful at court, and no one dared to utter a word to his discredit. Shortly afterwards, his marriage with the Countess of Essex was celebrated with the utmost splendor, the king himself being present at the ceremony. It would seem that Overby's knowledge of James's character was deeper than Rochester had given him credit for, and that he had been a true prophet when he predicted that his marriage would eventually estrange James from his minion. At this time, however, Rochester stood higher than ever in the royal favor. but it did not last long. Conscience, that busy monitor, was at work. The tongue of rumor was never still, and Rochester, who had long been a guilty, became at last a wretched man. His cheeks lost their color, his eyes grew dim, and he became moody, careless, and melancholy. The king, seeing him thus, took at length no pleasure in his society, and began to look about for another favorite. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, was the man to his mind, quick-witted, handsome, and unscrupulous. The two latter qualities alone were sufficient to recommend him to James I. In proportion as the influence of Rochester declined, that of Buckingham increased. A falling favorite has no friends, and rumor wagged her tongue against Rochester louder and more pertinaciously than ever. A new favorite, too, generally endeavors to hasten by a kick the fall of the old one, and Buckingham, anxious to work the complete ruin of his forerunner in the king's good graces, encouraged the relatives of Sir Thomas Overbury to prosecute their inquiries into the strange death of their kinsman. James was rigorous enough in the punishment of offences when he was not himself involved. He piqued himself, moreover, on his dexterity of unraveling mysteries. The affair of Sir Thomas Overbury found him congenial occupation. He sent to work by ordering the arrest of Sir Jarvis Elwes. James, at his early stage of the proceedings, does not seem to have been aware that Rochester was so deeply implicated. Struck with horror at the atrocious system of slow poisoning, the king sent for all the judges. According to Sir Anthony Weldon, he knelt down in the midst of them and said, "My lords the judges, it is lately come to my hearing that you have now in examination a business of poisoning. Lord, in what a miserable condition shall this kingdom be, the only famous nation for hospitality in the world, if our tables should become such a snare that none could eat without danger of life, and that Italian custom should be introduced among us. Therefore, my lords, I charge you, as you will answer it at that great and dreadful day of judgment, that you examine it strictly, without favor, affection, or partiality. And if you shall spare any guilty of this crime, God's curse light on you and your posterity. And if I spare any that are guilty, God's curse light on me and my posterity forever." Duke of Buckingham. The imprecation fell but too surely upon the devoted house of Stuart. The solemn oath was broken, and God's curse did light upon him and his posterity. The next person arrested after Sir Jarvis Elwes was Weston, the underkeeper, then Franklin and Mrs. Turner, and lastly the Earl and Countess of Somerset, to which dignity Rochester had been advanced since the death of Overbury. Weston was first brought to trial. Public curiosity was on the stretch. Nothing else was talked of, and the court on the day of trial was crowded to suffocation. The State Trials report that Lord Chief Justice Coke laid open to the jury the baseness and cowardliness of poisoners, who attempt that secretly against which there is no means of preservation or defense for a man's life, and how rare it was to hear of any poisoning in England, so detestable it was to our nation. But the devil had taught divers to be cunning in it, so that they can poison in what distance of space they please, by consuming the nativum calidum or humidum radicale in 1 month, 2 or 3 or more as they list, which they 4 manner of ways to do execute, viz. Haustu, gustu, odore, and contactu. Lord Coke. When the indictment was read over, Weston made no other reply than, "Lord, have mercy upon me! Lord, have mercy upon me!" On being asked how he would be tried, he refused to throw himself upon a jury of his country, and declared that he would be tried by God alone. In this he persisted for some time. The fear of the dreadful punishment for contumacy (Footnote: The punishment for the contumacious was expressed by the words onere, frigore, et fame. By the first was meant that the culprit should be extended on his back on the ground, and weights placed over his body, gradually increased until he expired. Sometimes the punishment was not extended to this length, and the victim, being allowed to recover, underwent the second portion, the frigore, which consisted in his standing naked in the open air for a certain space in the sight of all the people. The third, or fame, was more dreadful. the statute saying that he was to be preserved with the coarsest bread that could be got, and water out of the next sink or puddle to the place of execution. And that day he had water, he should have no bread, and the day he had bread, he should have no water. And in his torment he was to linger as long as nature would hold out. End footnote. Induced him at the length to plead not guilty, and take his trial in due course of law. All the circumstances against him were fully proved, and he was found guilty and executed at Tyburn. Mrs. Turner, Frankland, and Sir Jarvis Elwes were also brought to trial, found guilty, and executed between the 19th of October and the 4th of December, 1615. But the grand trial of the Earl and Countess of Somerset did not take place till the month of May following. On the trial of Sir Jarvis Elwes, circumstances had transpired, showing a guilty knowledge of the poisoning on the part of the Earl of Northampton, the uncle of Lady Somerset, and the chief falconer, Sir Thomas Monson. The former was dead, but Sir Thomas Monson was arrested and brought to trial. It appeared, however, that he was too dangerous a man to be brought to the scaffold. He knew too many of the odious secrets of James I, and his dying speech might contain disclosures which would compromise the king. To conceal old guilt, it was necessary to incur new. The trial of Sir Thomas Monson was brought to an abrupt conclusion, and himself set at liberty. Already James had broken his oath. He now began to fear that he had been rash in engaging so zealously to bring the poisoners to punishment. That Somerset would be declared guilty there was no doubt, and that he looked for pardon and impunity was equally evident to the king. Somerset, while in the Tower, asserted confidently that James would not dare to bring him to trial. In this he was mistaken, but James was in an agony. What the secret was between them will now never be known with certainty, but it may be surmised. Some have imagined it to be the vice to which the king was addicted, while others have asserted that it related to the death of Prince Henry, a virtuous young man who had held Somerset in especial abhorrence. This prince died early, unlamented by his father, and, as public opinion whispered at the time, poisoned by Somerset. Probably some crime or other lay heavy upon the soul of the king, and Somerset, his accomplice, could not be brought to public execution with safety. Hence the dreadful tortures of James when he discovered that his favorite was so deeply implicated in the murder of Overby. Every means was taken by the agonizing king to bring the prisoner into what was called a safe frame of mind. He was secretly advised to plead guilty and trust to the clemency of the king. The same advice was conveyed to the countess. Bacon was instructed by the king to draw up a paper of all the points of mercy and favor to Somerset which might result from the evidence, and Somerset was again recommended to plead guilty, and promised that no evil should ensue to him. The countess was first tried. She trembled and shed tears during the reading of the indictment, and, in a low voice, pleaded guilty. On being asked why sentence of death should not be passed against her, she replied meekly, "I can much aggravate, but nothing extenuate my fault. I desire mercy, and that the lords will intercede for me with the king." Sentence of death was passed upon her. Next day the earl was brought to trial. He appears to have mistrusted the promises of James, and he pleaded not guilty. With a self-possession and confidence which he felt, probably from his knowledge of the king's character, he rigorously cross-examined the witnesses and made a stubborn defense. After a trial which lasted 11 hours, he was found guilty and condemned to the felon's death. The Countess of Somerset. Whatever may have been the secrets between the criminal and the king, the latter, notwithstanding his terrific oath, was afraid to sign the death warrant. It might perchance have been his own. The earl and countess were committed to the Tower, where they remained for nearly 5 years. At the end of this period, to the surprise and scandal of the community and the disgrace of its chief magistrate, they both received the royal pardon, but were ordered to reside at a distance from the court. Having been found guilty of felony, the estates of the earl had become forfeited, but James granted him out of their revenues an income of £4,000 per annum. Shamelessness could not go further. Of the afterlife of these criminals nothing is known, except that the love they had formerly borne each other was changed into aversion, and that they lived under the same roof for months together without the interchange of a word. The exposure of their atrocities did not put a stop to the practice of poisoning. On the contrary, as we shall see hereafter, it engendered that insane imitation which is so strange a feature of the human character. James himself is supposed, with great probability, to have fallen victim to it. In the notes to Harris's Life and Writings of James I, there is a good deal of information on the subject. The guilt of Buckingham, although not fully established, rests upon the circumstances of suspicion stronger than have been sufficient to lead hundreds to the scaffold. His motives for committing the crime are stated to have been a desire of revenge for the coldness with which the king, in the latter years of his reign, began to regard him, his fear that James intended to degrade him, and his hope that the great influence he possessed over the mind of the heir apparent would last through a new reign, if the old one were brought to a close. End of Chapter 3, Part 1.